There's been a lot of rhetoric from the Turnbull government about proposals for infrastructure investment in tonight's budget. I hope there is significant infrastructure investment tonight, because we know that in recent times investment has fallen off a cliff. Parliamentary Budget Office has estimated that infrastructure investment as a proportion of the national economy will halve from 0.4 to 0.2% over the coming decade. We know that the government has been complacent and has relied upon completing projects that were begun when Labor was last in office. But of course those projects are now opened, so there's no pipeline of infrastructure projects that has been created by this government's neglect. Indeed though, we need to look at tonight's announcements with some scepticism. We know that in the first 4 budgets of the Abbott and Turnbull governments, the difference between what it's announced on budget night and what it's actually been invested is $4.8 billion. This table here shows the gap that's there between the rhetoric and budget night announcements and actual reality. It shows the gap between the announcements and the reality for road projects, for the Western Sydney Infrastructure Plan, for rail investment, right through to even the Black Spots program has seen this underinvestment. But there's another story as well, which is the creation of programs which pretend that infrastructure can be built but without any actual contribution from the government. Rhetoric like value capture, which hasn't been realised. Rhetoric such as loans, when what we know is that private capital is available for good infrastructure projects that will produce a return. Remember a few years ago, the Northern Australia Infrastructure Facility, $5 billion being announced with big fanfare. Well, we know that almost nothing has happened. Just one tiny project, and the $5 billion is still basically all there. Most expenditure has been having board meetings in the southern capitals of Sydney and Melbourne. It's simply not good enough because it hasn't stacked up. It's a bit like the idea that public transport projects can be built not with grant funding but with equity funding that will somehow produce a return to government and therefore can be delivered off budget, that is, without a cost to the bottom line. If someone tells you something's free and too good to be true, it usually is. And off-budget funding of public transport projects is too good to be true. But that's what the government is suggesting it would do for the airport link to Melbourne's airport. It's also what they're suggesting with the Western Sydney rail corridor from north to south through Sydney's airport at Badgerys Creek. What we need in this budget tonight is real dollars for real projects that create real jobs and provide a real boost to our national economy. Tonight, don't just look at the headline figure, look at the detail, because we know in the past much of the government's announcements simply hasn't stacked up and therefore hasn't been realised.